Ever wish you could walk into a newsroom like this one and talk to the journalists there about their work? What do they like best about their jobs? How do they find story ideas? What do they do when faced with an ethical dilemma? Well, we ventured into newsrooms on your behalf and asked those questions and more. We visited a paper of 75,000 circulation in Kalamazoo, Michigan, a mid-sized paper in Cincinnati, and a large urban daily in Chicago. We talked to veterans of the craft as well as cub reporters. Now let's start our newsroom interviews at the beginning of the story process with finding good ideas.
Story ideas are the hardest thing to come up with. They are worth their weight in gold, if an idea had any weight. They are a good idea. A page one quality idea is just very elusive, and it's kind of like trying to come up with a top 40s hit.
I think I know a story is a good one when it's something I want to tell my friends or my husband about, that I want to talk about. And oftentimes that isn't necessarily something that fits into a conventional definition of news.
But for me, it's something internal because I feel that it affects other people. And I can see the merit in it, even that it helps someone or it helps people to understand each other better, or it's even a pressing concern. And again, I think it's just something that as a reporter, I feel internally.
It's always about what impact it has on the public, so that's kind of self-evident a lot of times. I guess that's the short of it. I look at how you can develop it as a story as opposed to a report. So typically the best ones are people-driven. I'm less likely to be plugged into an institution. I'm more likely to be plugged into the people that are affected by what happens at that institution.
The way to get good story ideas is not to sit around in the newsroom and wait for calls to come in, but it's to go out there and get on your beat and spend your time out there and bring your good story ideas back.
School board meetings are actually great for getting story ideas. There are many things hidden in the agendas that may not be a story for that night, but become a story later that you can follow up on.
But when you go to church events, even kid events, other events, just kind of always have the radar up, even reading your own paper, and if not the articles your colleagues write, there are tons of little like news briefs and what's happening now, what's happening tomorrow things. Tons of organizations out there that just kind of file it away.
Again, I'm always looking for something new because I'm always looking for that new trend story or a quirky story. That's my thing. I like quirky, funny stories. So, and something that has an interesting twist to it. So those are the stories I'm usually going after, and I also want to look for something that isn't a very tiny, localized story. I want to look for a story that can give a broader perspective.
I'm always interested in the story behind the story, in taking apart something that might have been a brief news story and delving into it deeper, going back at a point later in time and seeing what happened. That's one place I always look for ideas, in the small 2-inch stories that get buried in the back of the paper.
I always end up writing columns about things that I have some kind of reaction to, and I think that journalists in general need to think about whether or not they're concentrating enough on the things that readers would have reaction to.
That the ability to see a story is just some people got it and some people don't, and the key is curious people who are engaged and are listening and are excited by things. Usually are the people who have good news judgment, which is fundamentally what you're asking.
As you've just heard, there are many ways to find story ideas. Briefs in the newspaper, attending meetings, talking to beat sources, going to community events, seeking out organizations, and relying on your own curiosity. Once you have a story idea, the next phase begins, reporting it out. But reporting is much more than just asking questions. It's also about research and observation. Good reporting helps you show a reader a story, rather than just telling it.
Try and learn as much about your subject before you go into an interview. You know, try and do some background research on the individual. If you're doing an interview of a person, or, you know, if you're talking about a subject, doing a story about a particular subject or a particular neighborhood, you know, always try and do as much research and have as much information going into it as you can.
I'll do extensive background searches and look up stories in LexisNexis and thoroughly read those, have set questions written down within my own mind sometimes at night. I mean, this is ridiculous. At night, I'll like go back and forth in my head, like the discussion that's going to unfold. And especially if it's something like in the case of this college president where I'm confronting him with something, I do have like a little scenario played out in my head. You know, if he answers the question this way, this is what my backup question is going to be. This is how I'm going to continue to press him until he gives me the answer that I want.
I think the most important thing whenever you're doing an uncomfortable, potentially uncomfortable interview is to just be yourself and be direct, and don't try to adopt some sort of persona that's not you. I approach people pretty simply. I would just introduce myself, say, you know, this is who I am, this is what I do for the paper, I'm interested in writing a story about your daughter. Would you be willing to sit down and talk with me? Sometimes if people are reluctant, I'll say, we don't need to sit down and talk for an interview. I'd just like the opportunity to meet you and tell you why I'm interested in writing this story. And sometimes people who are a little intimidated by the idea of sitting down with a reporter are a little more comfortable with the idea of just sitting down and talking about what they might talk about with you.
I think people respond better when they feel like you're not trying to take advantage of them. You're actually there doing a job, and you are relaying a story. You know, we're a mediator or an intermediary.
I'm always amazed that people are as open as they are. Because I'm non-threatening, and I always stand back from people. We have the advantage of not having to stick a microphone in their face. And you can essentially have a conversation, let's say, even in a situation where you're really literally out in public, in front of many people, where there's less of a concern about, is this guy psychotic or not? There's still always a need to put them at ease, at least let them know. Here's what I'm doing. If you don't want to talk to me, that's fine. Take care, have a good day. And I'm amazed at how many people want to be heard.
The issues certainly come up when you're talking about undocumented immigrants. There is a risk, and a risk, you know, to talking to the press and getting their picture in the paper and getting their name in the paper. So I try to explain, again, really emphasize what will be the effects of them being interviewed and using their name, and give them the option, really. I usually don't explicitly give people the option in general, but I think to them I like to say that you have the option of not using your full name, or we can, you know, use your not use your hometown, or do something else that's maybe a little more limiting.
Yes, no questions are awful with kids because they'll always answer with a yes or a no, and you really have to drag it out of kids.
The best stories, generally speaking, from my personal experience, have come when it took a last-minute turn, or when you just went with an open mind and interviewed people without having a preconceived notion of the answers that you wanted to get ahead of time.
I've really found that it's okay to not know things, and it's okay to ask the really basic question. And people, especially people who are experts in a field, which, you know, you're talking to some, at this newspaper, we end up talking to some of the best people on each subject. They don't mind going through the basics for journalists. They really want you to understand.
I think in every interview you're learning. You have to go in there as a learner and trying to learn what is the accuracy of this story.
I think the biggest mistake I see young reporters make when they interview is that they don't listen. They are so concerned with getting through their list of questions and so focused on themselves that they're not actually listening to the answers of the people that they're interviewing.
Let's review some tips for interviewing. Research a subject before the interview. Background your interview subject. Prepare questions. Rehearse the interview beforehand. Avoid questions with only yes and no answers. Keep an open mind. Go in to listen and learn. And be yourself. The interviews that journalists conduct are only as good as the sources from whom that information comes. Finding a good source requires research, time, and luck. But a good source is essential to giving a story authority and credibility.
In sourcing, you're looking for, one, you're looking primarily, as you read through the story, you're looking for how do I know this is true as a reader? As I'm reading through the story, how do I, from where does this story get its authority? And so one, you're going to have a drop-dead perfect source for the information in the first place.
Some of the people who turn out to be your best sources that might give you the great story that you don't even know what that is down the road, they're not going to give you that story unless they know you and have some sort of relationship with you. For example, I mean, if you, when you get a beat, it's smart to call up the city manager, the mayor, whoever else, the public officials on that beat, have a cup of coffee with them, you know, get to know them, talk to them. There's nothing wrong with talking to them on background, saying right up front, hey, you know, let's just talk off the record about things. Give me your impressions on what's going on. And that's just part of developing sources, and that's just part of being a person.
Getting different types of people in your stories, I think, is useful. Whether it's you're just going out, you know, asking someone about the weather or whatever, your man on the street, I think it's important to get outside your comfort zone and talk to people who maybe you normally wouldn't talk to. But, you know, being a reporter does let you open the door a little bit, so I think it's important to use that, you know, for the benefit of the story, really, and the readers.
These journalists shared some key points to remember about sources. Develop relationships to build sources. Seek out diverse sources. Use sources to give authority to a story. And check a source's background and credentials before using them in a story. One tool that journalists use to get up to speed on a topic is the internet. Online research can help you find good database information, find good sources, as well as double-check information. But be careful. The internet is also riddled with misleading and sometimes downright false information.
I use the World Wide Web constantly to find sources. I certainly use it to look up other reporters' stories and see, you know, who they've quoted on a story on single-gender classrooms or something like that. That's extremely helpful, but you're always looking for an association or experts, and the web is the best place to find that quickly.
I don't know anything but having access to the internet, so I mean, I can't imagine anything else. I mean, the ability to look up documents, reports, government reports online, print them out without leaving your desk, it's been a tremendous resource. Certainly the ability to get background information on people. You know, we have access to all kinds of databases where you can get job information, phone numbers, addresses, neighbors, financial information on people.
Before an interview, I usually type in the topic on Google, and I find things I never would have thought, or I use a search engine. It doesn't have to be Google, but I find associations, I find groups, I find sometimes related products, just a whole variety of sources. And I also type in the topic on LexisNexis and our own save system, our in-house search systems, to see what we've written on it. And I try to read everything I can on the topic before interviewing the person.
It's a minefield, I think. Certainly it's been like one of the great things to ever happen to journalism, that so many government documents are a matter of easily accessible public record now, where it used to be a struggle to file an FOI, get it back, you know, in a couple of months, and the instantaneous accessibility, especially government documents, is just terrific. The downside is, particularly when you're talking about websites of a particular special interest, something, I'm not going to hang my hat and reputation on the credibility of something I see in a website that I simply, there's no reason for me to assume that it's accurate, that it's factually accurate, that it's balanced and all that stuff. So I find it to be kind of a minefield, but for especially government documents, just terrific.
Journalists use the internet to look up clips, to find experts and associations, to find documents, to background sources, to locate sources, and journalists should always check all information they get from the internet for accuracy. Just as the internet is a research tool that journalists use to find information on a story subject, so are documents. There are public documents, such as a city budget or a government report, and there are private documents, such as a diary or personal letters. Both kinds of documents can illuminate a story in fresh and unpredictable ways.
I like to think of documents in a holistic sense, in the broadest possible sense, and I almost make a list to myself now before I start a story of documents I'm interested in, and I divide them into public documents and private documents. And public documents are the sorts of things you would expect them to be. They're police reports or government studies, budgets, all that kind of stuff. And private documents are the documents that people make and keep for themselves, and they could be anything from a journal entry to an inscription in a high school yearbook, a birthday card, anything like that. And I think one important thing to remember about both sorts of documents is that they're never dull. Even the sorts of documents that you may think would yield you nothing may have incredible detail in them.
We're big public records hounds here, and we believe that certainly we should have access to public documents. There are amazing things, again, hidden or even just in public documents that the public should have access to because of the Freedom of Information Act.
2 years ago I did a database project on essentially what turned out to be teen driving statistics. But I found that there had been a tremendous increase in the number of fatals involving teen drivers. There were 15 locally in 2000 at the point in October that I wrote that story. And I went to each family and asked them if they wanted to talk to me, not about their kid's death, because I already knew about that, but about their life. And all 15 said yes, and I think that's what drove that project. It did very well. And part of it was some of these kids, I mean, I was poring over report cards and letters to friends, and not so much diary entries, but things that you couldn't manufacture. They were just beautiful, simple examples of kids writing, say, what I'm looking forward to in my senior year of high school, and notes to boyfriends and girlfriends.
And all the information in the documents is interesting, but you don't want to overburden the reader with, oh, I had FOI this, and this is what I found out, this, and this. You don't want to tell everything to the reader because they really could care less. They just want the best stuff.
This segment explored the value of documents. Documents can be public, such as a record of city housing violations. Documents can be private, such as a personal note. Journalists should seek to humanize public documents. And another tip, avoid overburdening the reader with too much document information. As you'll learn in a moment, there are many different ways to write a story. But one thing these journalists have in common is that they begin writing the story before they sit down at the keyboard to tap out a lead. The best writing comes from solid and thorough reporting.
When you decide to go to work for a newspaper or you're freelancing, really it's very similar. You're writing for a client. You have somebody who's paying you for a work product, and you've made an agreement there. The agreement is, I'm going to write for you pretty much the way you want things written. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to bring my own sensibility to it, my own personality, my own voice to it, but it means that you publish a certain kind of thing, and I'm here to try to provide you with that certain kind of thing.
I try to write an outline first, sometimes because my editors make me, but sometimes because it's a helpful thing to do anyway. And then I always like to try and start with the top but sometimes that can be the hardest part of a story, and sometimes the middle is actually a good place to begin.
I am one of those people, I need to start with my lead, and so I can sit there. Sometimes I could sit there for an hour, 2 hours, and trying out leads, and you try it, and then you write a little bit more, and you say, this is really bad. And so you go back, and I start at the very top again. I have a hard time starting in the middle and going, I know some people start in the middle and they can go back and recreate the lead, but a lot of times I like to write the lead first. It kind of provides a roadmap for where the rest of the story is going. Almost when I can see the lead, I can almost tell where it's going to end.
I think the actual writing process actually starts while you're reporting, because one of the things that I try and do is, you always try and look for that point in the interview or point in whatever event that you're covering that could potentially be kind of like the lead of your story or the lead in, the one thing you want to hang your hat on. I almost start to try and write the story or get an idea of how I want to frame the story as the interview process or reporting process is going on. I usually try to, after I complete an interview or something, try and at least think about on the drive home, try and do an outline in my head of, what are the 4 or 5 points, 3, 4, or 5 points that I want to hit on in the story.
We have a great emphasis on writing and paying particular attention to the first 5 paragraphs of a story. In the first 5 paragraphs, you really need to know, you need to lure the reader in, you need to tell them what they're going to learn from the story, and you have to keep them hooked with some important facts.
I start with my lead and I go into what we call the nut graph, like what the story is all about. And it usually takes me hours and hours to get my first 3 or 4 paragraphs. And I've tried to change that and just kind of write big chunks of the story as I go, and I haven't been able to do that. I'm really much more of a top, write the lead, and then I turn in my story, and then the lead sometimes changes, sometimes doesn't, but I spend so much time on those first couple paragraphs, and that's one thing I've learned too, is kind of let go when those are changed, or if it just doesn't work, sometimes you just put it there to get a start, and what you're really after is that 3rd or 4th paragraph. We call it the nut graph, and is really the key to the whole story.
The best journalists out there answer the question of why. Why does something happen? Why are people doing what they're doing? Why should readers care? Why should anybody care about what you're writing? I mean, if you don't know the answer to that question, maybe you shouldn't write the story.
I look at the story in several themes, chunks really, of what I want to concentrate on. And I draw out an outline, almost the old-fashioned high school English paper outline with a theme, my central nut graph, and then sort of mini nut graphs on top of each chunk. If I were to have 3 separate chunks of what I want to write about, I write a mini nut graph for each of those separate chunks and then follow through each of those chunks and go back through my notes looking at quotes or ideas that would fit in with those respective chunks and fill them out on my outline and refer back to them in my notebook.
I'll look at some of the good quotes I have. For example, the woman complaining she's livid about the traffic, throwing up her hands, my God, this is terrible. I know I want that in a story. What I'll do is I'll create my story file. And on most systems I think you can do this, and I can show it to you. I put a split screen up there. I've got my notes file and I've got my blank story file. And when I saw that quote, I said, I know that's going to be in the story. I copied that over into my story file. And I went down through there and I saw various things that I just knew I wanted to be part of my story. And I'll copy some of those over in there. Well, a lot of people think you need to, and you do need to concentrate on your lead. You have to know where your story's going. But you don't necessarily have to rack your brain right at the outset to come up with your lead.
One thing that I'm still struggling with, and I've done this for 18 years, is writing in my voice, finding my voice and writing in my voice. And not just columnists, reporters have to do this too. And that is, you've got to picture in your head who you're writing for, you know, imagine them being human beings that you might know and relate to, and then write your stories in such a way that they might be interested, might be compelled to read it and understand it. You can't use the terminology of your beat. You've got to be able to boil that stuff down and explain to your readers why it's important. And sometimes you've got to, sometimes I imagine I'm writing a letter to a friend or to my mom or something like that, because that's how I check myself. I mean, would my mom understand this? Would she care?
I think it's an internal process. It's probably not, and certainly prioritizing in your mind, getting to the notes when they're fresh. I usually do circle and mark things. And even in my interview, listen for what the lead is, the lead might be.
The very best writing doesn't come from fancy little phrases, doesn't come from the pretty words. It comes from your notebook. The most compelling writing is always the result of the best, most thorough, most detailed, most penetrating reporting. And so people tend to break things in half, and they tend to think, all right, I'm going to go out, I'm going to report for a couple hours, and then that'll give me a couple hours to write by the end of the day. Instead of looking at it as one big, long process throughout the whole day, where they need to, while they're reporting, they should be thinking not only about the words, not only be looking for the lead, but they should be thinking about, how they're going to construct their story, what the story is going to look like on paper, and all, at the same time, they need to just be understanding it, make sure that they're following their own curiosity, make sure that they're completely mastering this topic, learning more than they're actually going to have to write. But still, they need to be thinking about, while they're reporting, they need to be thinking about the writing.
You've just heard some useful writing tips. Look for themes in your notes. Make a story outline based on those themes. You don't have to write the lead first. Write a nut graph that tells the focus of the story. Select strong quotes to anchor sub-themes. Use common language, and have more in your notebook than what you put in your story. It doesn't matter how well a story is written if there are mistakes and errors of fact in it. Journalists need to make every effort to double-check the information they get from sources. Successful journalists are committed to accuracy.
Accuracy is the hallmark of every great journalist, hallmark of any journalist. If it's not accurate, I don't want the story. If you're not an accurate reporter, you won't work at my newsroom. I mean, I will sacrifice a story for the next day's editions if there is any fear that there's a part of it that's not correct completely.
Yeah, I mean, well, accuracy is obviously important. I mean, and one of my little pet peeves that we could be better at, most papers could be better at, is the stupid little mistake that shows up, either that you create and they don't catch, or that's a copy editor or a headline writer or something. You can ruin a very good, well-researched and written piece by having some word misspelled that just kind of sticks out.
For me, because I do most of the work on the computer, and even if I've read through the story multiple times on the computer screen, if I have time, I'll make a printout and I'll go through and with a writing pen, and check it that way, because I always find things that I didn't see on the computer screen, but that were just pretty much flagrant on the hard copy. And here I'm talking mostly the things that I find are spelling or punctuation, words that I've inadvertently left out of sentences, articles, and stuff like that.
I check out everything. I just feel more comfortable that way. Everything I can, I check out. And you said people's memories are faulty. People don't always tell the truth for whatever reason. They may have a perfectly legitimate reason for telling you a lie, but you need to know it.
This segment emphasized the importance of accuracy. Double-check all facts, check for copy editing errors, and remember that good journalists keep accuracy at the forefront of their reporting. The reporter-editor relationship is a complex one. Reporters rely on editors to make sure their stories are fair and accurate. Editors rely on reporters to get a story in on time and to dig for stories beneath the surface of things. The best editor-reporter relationships are partnerships.
We try really hard at the Enquirer to make it a team process. So you both have to be coming at it from the same sheet of music. We try very hard to create a good, solid relationship. It's truly the most important part of my job, is my relationship with my reporters. And that's how I approach it, and I think that's how they approach it. And I admire their expertise and their knowledge and the stories they bring to the table, and support them.
All an editor is a reader, is a reader with some power to say no. But really, for very high-end reporters, we have many of those here at the Tribune who could really write the thing and just about put it in the newspaper. What do I do for those people? Well, I'm a reader who looks at a sentence, makes sure, looks at sentence by sentence at their story, make sure everything's making sense. There's not a writer out there who sometimes thinks that what they've written means one thing when most people who read it are going to read something else. So my job is to find those sentences and say, is this really what you meant?
Often I'll scratch and claw over and editing an aspect of the story that I know is important enough to be in there, or it's worded a certain way for a certain reason. So maybe I've earned some level of trust that, yeah, okay, we can revisit that, and oh, no, I see your point now, that type of thing. A lot of times, quite frankly, you just kind of have to let it go and say, hey, I busted my butt on this one 3-graph chunk of a story, and it just got whacked out by someone completely indifferent to how much effort I put into it, and you just got to let those go. If you don't, I think it'll probably eat you alive, so it's probably a survival technique as much as anything else.
If something's not going well, if you didn't get a big interview that you needed, if you're not going to have the draft of your story done the day that you say you are, you need to keep them informed enough that you're not showing up in their office at 5 o'clock Friday and saying, oops, there's no story here. And that's for any kind of story you do, whether you're doing daily stories or long-term stories. Don't hide things from your editors. Be honest with them. And the other thing, too, is to think about things from their perspective, too. They're not, I think sometimes reporters like to think editors are just people who want to tromp on their stories, and they're not. They're trying to get the best story in the paper, too. And if you think about working with them as working as part of a team, not as someone, as your editor, as your adversary, then you're much better off.
These writers just talked about the reporter-editor relationship, how it's a team process, that you should communicate a story's progress with an editor, and that copy changes are inevitable and usually beneficial. At least once each day, the top editors at a newspaper meet to talk about what will go on the next day's front page. The Page One meeting, as it is called at many papers, begins with editors pitching the best stories that reporters in their department are working on that day. Editors from each section briefly describe their best stories. Often, it is the managing editor of the paper, in consultation with others, who ultimately decides what stories and photographs will make the front page. On the day we visited the Chicago Tribune's Page One meeting, the biggest story by far was about 2 men suspected of being the snipers who had killed and injured innocent people on the streets in the Washington, D.C. area. One of the suspects was just 17 years old. An issue for the editors at the paper was whether to publish the name of the 17-year-old. If the teenager had been charged with the sniper shootings, the paper would not have hesitated to name him. But on this day, he was only a suspect. One question the editors asked themselves that day was whether the paper would be protecting the teenager by not naming him. If many other news outlets were reporting his name, then not naming him would offer the youth little, if any, privacy.
If everybody is, and this is no excuse to do it, I know, if everybody else is doing it, and we're the only ones who don't name him, I don't think that's a good use of the policy. think at this point, if the New York Times and the Post and the Baltimore Sun, our family newspaper, and other Tribune family newspapers are doing it, then I think we ought to rethink our policy on this one.
And that is our policy. Now, does that mean we should follow the policy out the window? I'm not going to say that without a lot of discussion.
My gut says ID, but I can't intellectually justify yet.
The editors debated for a half hour. There was universal agreement about what to do.
I don't hear a lot of argument not to identify him, so I am going to say we identify him and we run the picture, and if Anne Marie returns, I will bring that to her attention and she can overrule me if she likes. But in this instance, I think that for us not to identify him and not to run the picture is to be negligent to our readers. So let's do it.
The public interest was in that.
The next day, the front page of the Chicago Tribune ran the story about the sniper suspects and published the 17-year-old's name. As it turns out, so did every other major paper in the U.S. that day. To recap, a Page One meeting is used to select the stories for the front page. It involves editors from each section. It's a forum for discussion of the news value of stories, and it sometimes includes a discussion of ethical situations. As the Tribune's Page One meeting shows, ethics runs throughout the publication of every day's paper. There are public ethical decisions, such as whether to run a graphic photo. There are also private ethical decisions between a reporter and his or her conscience. Journalists are called on to seek the truth and report it fairly and accurately.
I was recently asked to be an advisory panel member on a panel that is trying to figure out how to recruit more young people into colleges of engineering. And I would have to work on a weekly basis with people who are my everyday sources. And one of my good sources asked me to be on this panel, and I had to decline. He didn't quite understand why, but I told him that I felt that it would put me in a situation where I would be too close to my sources on a regular basis, talking about issues that are pertaining to my beat.
When I actually took over this beat, I had been a member of the NAACP for probably, since I was in grade school. From a junior member up until probably about a year and a half ago. And, one of the questions or issues that I faced when I took over this beat was, maintaining that membership while also, potentially having to cover the organization. It was kind of came to the conclusion and the decision that I couldn't be a member and also cover the group as well. Not because I didn't feel that I could do it and not produce unbiased journalism, but just because of the perception that some who might want to use that as leverage to perhaps claim something or another about the way you might write a story or cover that particular organization. So that was actually something I had to give up, when I took over this beat.
The ones that are really challenging are the day-to-day ones, which is when you're working a beat and you develop relationships with sources, how do you deal with those sources? One that happens all the time is, you become dependent on people, on sources for information. And then what happens when you're going to write a story that isn't necessarily complementary to that source? You have to make a decision, and you have to make sure that you can still honestly, work that beat, work that source, which means sometimes writing bad things. It's really biting the hand that feeds you, but you have to do it. And that's something that every beat reporter deals with on a daily basis. And it's something that they have to remind themselves how important it is to be truthful to the whole beat, to the whole job.
You know, the other thing about ethics is the use of unidentified sources. And that's something that I think every newspaper wrestles with. You know, when do you use an unidentified source? We have a high summit here when it comes to using unidentified sources. The editor of the newspaper is involved, the reporter is involved, the line editor, usually me, who oversees the story itself, and the department. We talk about the merits of the sourcing. Young reporters, I think, often get hoodwinked by a source who says, I will tell you something as long as you keep my name out of the newspaper. And sometimes it's easy to be intimidated and not push to make sure that you've got that person who is offering you a bit of information, but on the record, completely identified, or using that tidbit of information and finding another source to confirm it on the record. But even in veteran reporters, there are times when the use of unidentified sources come up. And it's a major ethical debate here. Do you use an unidentified source, or do you disregard that information, or how do you find a way to get it in the newspaper with a name attached to it? And usually it's a judgment call by the top editor here. There are several stories that we have pursued and we have written and we have used it. Then there are other stories where we're not as comfortable with the sourcing and we've sacrificed a perceived break on a story because we don't believe the information is wholeheartedly correct or the sourcing on the story is suspect.
It's case-by-case basis, and you know, I find if you have the right ideals in your ethical reporter, then usually the right answer will come to you in terms of common sense on those things. I don't think it's a big deal, but I won't take anything more than a water from anybody that I'm covering. These city commission budget meetings, they've got, you know, snacks and pops and coffee and all that stuff laying out, and I just don't do it because it's easier for me to draw the line there and say, no, I'm not going to take anything from anybody or any bodies that I cover. You know, I don't want to be standing there picking over the hors d'oeuvres with a city commission that the city commission budget paid for, you know, as the reporter that covers the city commission.
As journalists, you know, I think we have to try and avoid, you know, conflicts. I think we have an obligation to avoid conflicts of interest, but also we're still people too, and we have lives outside of the job, and I think, you know, in certain situations, I think sometimes you have to give in to that, and then in other situations, I think, you know, you have to kind of stick with what you believe in as a person, because, you know, I mean, we're all subject to our opinions and biases. I think being aware of that and countering that is the key. You know, I'm not one who believes in the idea of complete and total objectivity. I think everything is very much subjective, from the questions that we ask to the way that we decide to frame stories. I think there's a difference between being objective and being fair and balanced, and I think as journalists we need to be fair and balanced.
The preceding discussion on ethics emphasizes that journalists should avoid even the perception of bias. Be truthful to the whole beat, not just a favorite source. Avoid accepting gifts. Avoid conflicts of interest. Strive to be fair and balanced, and act independently. I hope you can tell the journalists we've been talking to truly love their jobs. We'll let them tell you why.
No, you do something different every day. It is so cool. There's always something happening. You're always busy. You can even get addicted to the adrenaline. That's the problem. You can change jobs very easily, especially within a big newsroom. You can change beats. You can do something different. You get to go out with all these cool people and you have an expense account, you know. You get to travel. You get to occasionally break that big story. And then, of course, there's the #1 reason, and that's seeing your byline in the paper.
My favorite part of the job is still when I know that I'm done with the gathering. Not that I don't like that or get a kick out of that sometimes, but the real rush is when I'm at the computer with a blank screen and like ready to type. I like it.
It's such an important job. that at least there's a sense of purpose every day. You have some really horrific days and some exhilarating days, and most of them are somewhere skidding in between, but it's always important. So I would try and focus on that when things aren't swimming so neatly. We have an incredibly important job in the kind of government and culture that we have set up. So I try and keep that in mind.
That's the great thing about being a reporter. You get to meet different people. You get to hear different stories. Sometimes you even get to go to cool places, you know, to cover stories. So it's never the same thing.
One of the things that really intrigues me is human nature, trying to figure out why people do things that they do, and what makes them tick. And I especially like interviewing people whose lives have taken these twists and turns. I just find it really, really fascinating. And so when I interview people, I get to hear these great stories, you know? I don't think any other profession gets this chance where you can actually see a person's life. And it's like you're constantly reading a book, you know?
You know, I still think on whatever level it is, whether you're working for a small weekly, or whether you're working for the New York Times, you're writing what you write because you think people care about it to some degree, regardless of what the beat is. You know, regardless of whether it's news or a feature or something. You're writing something that you think has some use and some value to people, and you can reach people tens of thousands at a time. And to me, you know, it's still a pretty noble profession.
These journalists say that the benefits of being a journalist are learning new things, meeting new people, traveling, having a variety in their work, providing a public service, and helping people. You just heard some of the reasons why journalism is a great career. Now let's hear some of the reasons why it's also a tough profession.
Pay isn't great, the hours are awful. You know, I have 2, 3.5-year-old kids, and I don't put them to bed at night. You know, I get to see them in the morning, but I work very late. You know, I work holidays. You know, every year I work a couple of holidays. You know, newspapers, if you're an editor, American newspapers are morning newspapers, which means they get printed sometime around midnight, which means you're working at night, which means that you know, you don't go out on Friday nights because you're working on the Saturday or the Sunday paper. So the hours are really the big downside. Plus your job can follow you around. You know, when you're off, you're still working.
The downside is that you know, it's a tough business. I mean, and you've got to have really thick skin, and because you're going to take some hits. I mean, people just aren't going to like. I mean, as journalists, you know, and as people, I think, you know, there's a natural inclination to want everybody to like everything you do, and it's just not the case. I mean, you know, and if you can't take some of the hits and the criticism that goes along with it, it can be a tough job, and it can wear on you.
Everybody hates the media. Everybody hates journalists, and so you're constantly attacked, and you have to get a thick skin. Otherwise, it's really hard to stay in the business.
My least favorite part, without question, is on stories where you have to interview family members of deceased people. It's awful, and I don't think I'll ever get used to it. Have to do it sometimes, and I don't like it at all.
I think just the sort of chaotic nature of the job in some ways. I think, you know, certainly any dinner plan, any vacation is, you know, written in pencil. And I think every day you don't know how late you'll be working, and I think that can take its toll on personal relationships, that sort of thing.
These journalists say that there are challenges to being a journalist, like the sometimes long and chaotic hours, the around-the-clock nature of the job, interviewing victims of tragedy, and some people's dislike of anyone from the media. If after hearing all that, you still want to be a journalist, our team of reporters has some valuable guidance for you. Many of them got where they are by heeding their own advice. Listen and take notes.
I always say people who are in college should always look for internships, and they should also work at the college newspaper. I never did any of that, and so I had to learn how to write. I had to learn how to tell a story. These were all things that I had to learn really, over the last 8 years. So I still consider myself as learning. So as much experience that you can have under your belt before you graduate, the better. It helps you get a better position, at a better staff, gets you a better staff position at a paper, a higher paper. If you come with experience, you should get it before you graduate, which means doing internships in the summer, working at the college paper.
Internships, 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 especially for people who are coming in today. I was an English major, and I knew I wanted to get into journalism, but my tiny little private college didn't even have a journalism major. So for me, it was key to start out interning at the local newspaper in my community.
Start somewhere, doesn't matter where it is. I started at an extremely small paper, a 5,000 circulation paper with absolutely no journalism experience at all, other than working on my high school paper. I didn't take any journalism classes in college. I didn't work on my college paper. Hardly anybody would look at me until I finally found this one small paper that was willing to take a chance. And I could not have gotten a better journalism education than I got there. I did everything. I covered cops. I covered city council meetings. I wrote feature stories. I covered court cases. I did absolutely everything. And I was lucky enough to work for people who really cared about doing that job right.
If they're still in college, take every course outside journalism you can. Study a different language. Research Scandinavian history, Hispanic culture, U.S. history, because journalism, and I have both bachelor's and master's degrees from good journalism schools. They teach you the craft, but they don't give you the knowledge and the curiosity and the backbone for just having lots of great ideas and being able to talk to lots of different people. You can't be narrow anymore.
When you're in there talking to somebody to hire them, what you want is proof that they can do the job. The only way that you can see that proof is in clips. So internships are absolutely critical, and they become really, they're far and away the best way for people to get into the business because they can start at a small paper, get a proven body of work, build relationships with editors. Editors at all papers like interns and want them to do well, and usually look at it as a relationship where they're trying to help that intern.
You want somebody to walk into an interview and be able to hand you, hopefully, a portfolio of great clips. Someone who's gotten their hands dirty with ink, who's gotten their hands dirty with public records, and is a heart of a lion who wants to go into this great profession and make a difference. The other thing is someone who's got fire in the gut. There's a quote that I've got on my desk. It's from Teddy Roosevelt. It says, "Far and away the best prize that life offers is to work hard at work worth doing." And I believe that. And I believe that that applies directly to journalism. I will take a reporter who might not have as much experience as somebody else if that journalist can step forward and convince me I'm passionate, I'm smart, and I'm going to work my butt off to make a difference in your newspaper and in your community. If that person's dedicated to changing their corner of the world and they've got the technical skills to back it up, he or she will be working for me.
In conclusion, these journalists offer first-hand advice for entering the field of journalism. Get internships, write for a college paper, start at any size publication, take courses outside journalism, assemble a portfolio of clips, and be energetic and inquisitive. As our broadcast colleagues would say, that's a wrap. Thanks for joining our newsroom adventure.